Magadon Hapon. And good afternoon to all of you. I would first of all like to thank the Institute for having me this afternoon, and I would like to thank each and every one of you for being here this afternoon, because I understand that for some of you it's a holiday, and I'm really touched that you've decided to suspend the holiday for a brief period of time to come here to have a good exchange, and I hope we can make it as productive as we can together, and that you can then go back to your holiday. Actually, you know, this moment during my day, during my stay in any country, is in a way the most privileged moment for me. Not just because you remind me of who I was many years ago, which is always nice, you know, no white hair, no wrinkles, a lot of energy, less fat, all of that. Not only because, very much so, you will be feeding pension schemes, and therefore my retirement, but because you're the future. And to work as head of an international institution whose mission is financial stability and making sure that countries help each other in case of trouble, and have the privilege of talking to and listening to the ladies and gentlemen who will be the future of the world is a very privileged moment. So thank you very much for giving me that opportunity of seeing you, talking to you, and listening to what you have to say. Now, you might wonder why the Institute? Yeah, could have been any other place actually. And on this occasion, I'd like to express my special thanks to Dean Ricardo Lin, to Chairman Napoleon Nazareno, and to Emeritus Chairman Washington Cecil for having helped organize and taken this initiative. But why the Asian Institute of Management? Well, you know the answer. Because it's one of the best institutes, not only in the Philippines, but also in the region, and because it prepares you, and it has prepared before you, 37,000 alumni to actually be good citizens, be good leaders, and be well prepared to take up the challenges of tomorrow. That's what you are doing. And I looked, Dean, at the actual mission of the school, because as a lawyer by background, I'm always interested in the articles of incorporation and the why. You know, what's in Article 1? Well, the mission, according to what I saw, is the following. We are committed towards making a difference in promoting the sustainable development of Asian societies by developing professional, entrepreneurial, and socially responsible leaders and managers. Now, this is very important, and it's very important to me, those three words: professional, entrepreneurial, and socially responsible leaders and managers. So it made my choice very easy. Why the Institute? Well, because of that mission, which is embodied in those few words. And those are virtues, qualities that I think are most needed in today's world, particularly given the complexities, the interconnections, the sense of being lost in the middle of nowhere, to which you are very strongly connected, and where you're not sure exactly how responsible you are, to whom you're accountable. So to have those three virtues identified with leadership and management, I think is exactly appropriate. What I would like to do on this occasion is to talk to you about three particular topics. And if any one of those three topics is too boring for you, you have the choice to opt out for any of the three by being very quiet and letting the others have the benefit if they like it. The first one that I would like to talk about is the underestimated accelerator and contaminator factor. And you'll have to guess what that is. Second thing that I would like to touch on is the policy priorities in the advanced economies and how the advanced economies can learn the Asian lesson, if you will. The third topic is what else can Asian countries, what else can Asia do to actually consolidate and achieve its potential? But let me turn to the first one. I mentioned the acceleration and contamination agent. I'm going to turn it over to you. Who in this room does not have a cell phone? Raise your hand. Aha. That confirms what the Vice President said to me this morning, that the penetration of internet in the Philippines was about 30%, but the penetration of the mobiles in the Philippines was about 112%. One of you will have to explain to me the 12%. Yeah, several at a time. You're absolutely right. Okay, second question. Which ones amongst you bank, manages its finances by going to the bank, talking to the person behind the counter, and checking its account by so doing? All right, you have the answer to my two questions. The acceleration factor is the super fast connectivity that we have observed, massive development in the last decade. That's number one. The contamination factor is actually the financial flows that are carried generally on those transmission processes that we use, generally via the internet, but via any other electronic devices, particularly mobile telephones. And I was really interested to listen to the Secretary of Budget this morning, who explained to me how the cash transfer program is actually instrumented, using essentially as a carrier the mobile telephone, to make sure that those people who are either remote geographically or remote because they lack the financial literacy, yet have access to their cash transfers through mobile telecommunication. And those are some of the really positive aspects of connectivity and interconnectedness. Turning now to the crisis. What have we learned from the crisis? What are we learning from each and every crisis that we go through? I think it was one of your national heroes, José Rizal, who once said, and I want to quote him properly, "He who does not know how to look back at where he came from will never get to his destination." And that's a really strong and powerful statement. You have to be able to look back at the crisis, or the crises, the ones from the past and the one that we are just going through, to understand why it has gone so fast, why it has just spread out in next to no time, starting from a couple of funds that went belly up in a particular corner of the world and has affected so many economies in the developed economies world. And clearly one of the lessons that we're learning from this crisis, and that we had, in my view, largely underestimated or had little appreciation for, is the true extent of economic and financial interconnections between regions, between countries, and between people. The global economy is more interconnected than ever. Over the past, I'll give you just a few numbers. Over the past 3 decades, the volume of world trade has increased 5 times. And obviously Asia leads the way. Over the past decade alone, trade within Asia tripled. And regional trade amongst emerging Asia grew even faster. That I was talking about trade. The same is true for financial flows. By the time of the crisis in 2008, the global capital flows were 3 times the volume of financial flows in 1995. So interconnections, acceleration of those have actually amplified a movement that is just natural by virtue of growth, but it has done so on a regional and on a global basis. And in this global economy, connections never stop. They never stop. You don't turn the off button, you can hardly turn the pause button. It keeps going all the time. It's just like your emails or your tweets or anything that you receive electronically. It keeps coming in. You can switch off the machine. Yeah, you can go to bed. But if you turn it on, shoop, it's all back in and in big volumes. The same is true in the global economy. And it's like a big hive of constant interconnections. And guess where is the center at the moment? Yes, absolutely. Asia, through its very dense networks and through its broad financial reach. Now, we've seen with the example of the cash transfer programs, and the same would apply in Brazil, and the same would apply in Mexico, and the same would apply in Kenya, because in all those countries they're using the same devices to make sure that money goes to where it should go. Great opportunities as a result of those interconnections. But there are also great threats as a result of interconnections. Because in this interconnected world, and I spare a lot of the very, very negative things that can come out of uncontrolled connectivity. Sparing you that, the smallest economic drumbeat can actually have massive deflagration effects around the world. It's the chaos theory of the butterfly, where an electronic retailer going bust in London can actually disrupt manufacturing all across Asia, where an earthquake in Japan can actually stop the manufacturing of car in Detroit, or in Corbeil-Essonnes, or in any place in the world, because of those interconnections. Where a weak bank in Europe, not any of those global systemic financial institution, the global SIFIs, for those of you who are working on financial matters. No, just a remote, obscure bank somewhere in Europe can actually have massive repercussions in terms of available liquidity in Latin America. Those are the kinds of interconnections that we also have to put up with, if I may say, when we cannot find the switch off button and when we don't have the pause button. We're seeing this across Asia today as well. For a period of time, many of us thought, sovereign debt crisis, financial crisis, bank crisis in Europe, it will be contained. It will not have massive repercussions outside Europe. But this is not the case. And certainly the latest development that we're seeing in 2012 is that those markets that we thought would be immune, the emerging market economies, those that have driven the show lately, are also suffering as a result of the slowdown of the economies of Europe or the United States. So we are seeing it here just as much. The connections between regions, the connections between Asia and the rest of the world are just too strong for those countries, for our countries here, to be actually immune from the consequences of those big butterfly, big wings elsewhere in the world. Demand from Europe and from the United States each account for about 1/3 of emerging Asia's net exports. And foreign participation in local government bond markets has risen substantially. So the connections are intimate and they are very strong, whether it's a matter of trade or whether it's a matter of financial relationships. So what is the way forward? We cannot simply turn back the clock. It doesn't work that way. We should not become as, and again I don't want to misquote, as Ninoy Aquino said so eloquently, a floating flotsam in the floods of time. After all, it's all about change, and it's all about life. So instead, what we must do is actually accept this interconnectedness, not turn our back to it, but make sure that we actually draw the benefits of it, the positive, and make sure that we can identify early enough and have our alert system on for all the negatives, and be able, for those particular areas, to find, in my view, two buttons that are key. One is for those of you who are familiar with hi-fi, the old way, two buttons. Pause, because it gives you time to deal with the issue, and balance. And I'll come to the issue of balance later on. But to be able to actually pause means try to be ahead of the curve on the event early enough and big enough so that you have a bit of time to deal with the structural issues. And balance, because clearly there is an issue of imbalances that are at the roots of the problems that we're going through at the moment. Imbalances within some economies, imbalances globally between regions. It's happening, but it has to continue to happen, and probably a bit more than it does at the moment. And that brings me to my second point, which is the policy priorities that must be adopted by the advanced economies and how they can learn the Asian lesson. I said that at our Tokyo annual meeting that took place about 3 weeks ago now in Tokyo. What policymakers need to do is not define policies, is not talk about policies, it's act. Implement the policies, make sure that they are put in place and that there will be consequences, that there will be spillover effects that are anticipated and analyzed. What are those policies? Well, they're policies that will be able to generate sustainable growth and create jobs. Now, it's a bit funny for the managing director of the IMF to talk about jobs. And I do. And I claim the privilege to talk about jobs as a priority. What do we have at the moment? Over 200 million people unemployed, of which, you know how many your age around the world without jobs? 70 million. 70 million young people, some of them educated, some of them with diplomas, who simply cannot find a job. The crisis itself has generated over 30 million additional unemployed. So we had roughly 170 million, to which an additional 30 has been added. And within that group of over 200, 70 are young people under the age of 25. Now, if they cannot find their job, probably means that we are not doing our job. And everybody has to play their part, because that applies to many countries, many people around the world. In the Philippines, for instance, if you look at the unemployment official numbers, there are many more young people who are unemployed than there is an average unemployment rate. 17% unemployed people in the Philippines. It pales relative to the number of unemployed people in Spain, for instance, or in Greece. But it is still a lot more than is acceptable. So what needs to be done? Let me just focus on two areas which we've identified at the IMF as areas of risks, where policies have to be acted upon. The first one that comes to mind, which is probably the most urgent, one that is being discussed almost as we speak, or later on in their day, is the United States of America, where clearly both the debt ceiling and the fiscal cliff have to be addressed, have to be dealt with as a matter of priority. Why is that? Because of the level of uncertainty that is associated with the lack of determination, lack of vision, lack of mid-term anchoring of policies. Because if you are an entrepreneur, if you are an executive in a company that is, for instance, involved in the defense industry, well, you're not too sure whether or not, as a result of sequestration, which is these budgetary principles according to which some of the budgets are simply cancelled for the future automatically, you're just not sure that you're going to have a contract next year. And as a result, you're not sure that you need to continue to employ those people who are servicing those contracts. If you are in any business, you're not exactly sure what kind of tax will apply going forward, and therefore you're not sure whether you need to invest or how you're going to invest and what your return on investment is going to be. So because of that uncertainty, those are priorities that need to be addressed very shortly. The second area, and as I said, for the United States, it's a matter of the short term, the immediate priority, because the cliff is coming up in early January, but it's also a matter of the medium term, because people need to know whether in the medium term there is a political determination to actually reduce deficit and redress the trajectory of debt to make it lighter. Second geographical area where there is a priority is the Eurozone, where clearly policies have been identified, there is a project, but there is implementation needed in the area of fiscal union, in the area of banking union, and at a regional as well as at a national level. It's happening, but it's happening probably with too much uncertainty associated with it, and the lack of credibility that has resulted from this very incremental, very gradual, very piecemeal approach that has been taken so far. Now, what is there to be learned from Asia? Well, Asia was an early adopter in the interconnected world. It saw the opportunities, it grabbed them, and it's reaping the rewards. Just look at how far emerging Asia has gone. Over the course of 3 decades, its share of emerging Asia, let me be clear, includes indeed China, but does not include Japan, Australia, New Zealand. So emerging Asia, its share of the world GDP has jumped from 10% to 30% in 3 decades. Living standards rose 6-fold, and an incredible 500 million people were lifted out of poverty as a result. This is a remarkable achievement. After the Asian crisis in the 1990s, Asia embraced change, not without laborious, difficult processes, not without huge sacrifices, not without misery and suffering, but it emerged as a result. Stronger, less vulnerable, more resilient, thanks to sound macroeconomic policies and structural reforms that were implemented, sometimes very forcefully and very quickly. Both public and private sector finances have been managed better, with less deficit, less debt, less vulnerability. And Asia at the time did not draw the wrong lessons from the crisis. It could have, retracted. It could have pulled up the drawbridges or withdrawn from the world, isolated itself. Quite to the contrary, it did not do that. So over the past decade, emerging Asia has proved its mettle, growing by more than 7.5% average per year. Here in the Philippines, the average growth in the last 10 years has been in the range of 5% and is getting better. In fact, it was Asia, and emerging Asia in particular, that kept the global growth going in the last 3 years, providing about 2/3 of global growth from 2007 to 2011. A broader lesson is that if not immune, because as I said, particularly in 2012, we're seeing the spillover effects, the consequences of what is affecting the United States and Europe in this part of the world. So if not immune, the emerging markets have become more resilient in recent years, growing for longer periods of time and certainly bouncing back faster in bad times. IMF research suggests that better policies account for 3/5 of this improvement. This is a good lesson for the advanced economies in crisis today. The good, sound macroeconomic policies that were adopted and the structural reforms that have transformed societies have made those economies stronger, your economies stronger, more resilient, with enough buffers to actually resist the consequential effects of crisis happening elsewhere. And the Philippines is a good example of this resilience in action. Over the past decade, its economy has been held aloft by remittances. Remittances that today account for at least 10% of its GDP. Now you might say this is at risk because if other economies elsewhere are affected, this is going to be reducing the volume of remittance. But it is so scattered, it is so well balanced in many sectors of societies and in so many economies around the world that there is a natural hedge as a result of that. And what does it do? Well, it certainly provides that cushion, that buffer, that protects the Philippine economies from the volatility that results from capital flows in and out, depending on circumstances, depending on interest rates. That takes me to my third point. How can Asia go even further and actually realize its full potential? Because Asia resistance cannot be taken for granted. Policymakers must continue to keep the situation in check and to actually apply the policy mix that will keep those economies strong. They must walk the narrow line, for example, between reaping the rewards of capital flows while avoiding their cost, taking the right set of macroprudential measures in order to avoid the volatility and massive appreciation risks that can occur as a result. This means keeping policies focused on growth and financial stability, and they are not mutually exclusive. They are compatible. I personally believe that Asia will manage that and will pull it through. I believe that growth will pick up again, and we certainly in our forecast assume that growth in Asia will be probably at least 2 percentage points higher than average growth on a global basis. I also believe that Asia will play a leading and guiding role in the world economy. In less than 2 decades, so in not 2012, 2032, you'll be engaged and active in productive life. Well, if the trends that we observe today continue, in 2 decades, Asia will have overtaken the United States and Europe combined GDP source of growth. The 21st century shall belong to you. It shall belong to all, but you will be critical actors. You will be critical actors of that century. But Asia still has a bit of distance to cover. It's not going to happen just like that. Continuation of trends will be a factor of the policy mix, will be a factor of the determination of political leaders to apply the right recipes and to respect those good principles. It particularly needs to avoid the hazardous, what we call the middle income trap, where you only grow so far, but not further, because there is enough gravity that keeps the country from growing further. It's a phenomenon that was observed essentially in Latin America, but clearly needs to be avoided in this part of the world as the economies grow. And to avoid that middle income trap, I personally believe that there are three principles that need to apply. One is inclusion, the second is integration, and the third one is better governance. So what do I mean by inclusion? Well, inclusion means to make sure that everybody benefits from globalization, from growth, and for that, it has to become more inclusive, lifting everybody together, not those that are fully educated, that have the privilege of being part of the elite, but everybody in order to build actually a solid middle class. I'm not inventing anything new. If you look at the ancient Greeks, if you read Aristotle, for instance, they were already saying that. And if you listen to some of the key leaders of the day, they're all saying that. Building a middle class that will actually bring along as many people as possible. It goes hand in hand with the need of rebalancing demand from the advanced countries towards the emerging markets, including here in Asia. Now this is happening, and that's what I meant by try to find the balance button. When you look at the current account of China, for instance, it has moved from double-digit to a little less than 3%. This is rebalancing happening. A society and an economy that is less driven by exports and that is refocusing on its domestic market for investment purposes, but also for consumption purposes. I was a couple of days ago in Malaysia. This is clearly the policy orientation that has been selected by the leaders in that country, to refocus on the domestic market and to make sure that there are the right safety nets in place to encourage the population to actually consume, save a bit, but consume, because they feel that their domestic market is taken care of and available for them. Despite the major gains in growth and poverty reduction over the past few decades that we've mentioned earlier, income inequality is on the rise in many corners of the world, but particularly in Asia. Some countries in Asia have really worked hard at dealing with inequalities in the 70s, in the 80s, but lately, not much. It's picking up in the last couple of years, but it really has to be addressed. In a country like the Philippines, you all know that of the 100 million plus population, 42 live with less than $2 a day. Talk about inequality. This is clearly an indication of how serious it is. And the poor have not gained much as a result of added growth. How does it happen? How do we make growth more inclusive? Not just using words and giving speeches, but how does it happen in real life? Well, safety nets is certainly one answer. More public spending on healthcare, more public spending on education, covering more people under pension schemes, under unemployment insurances, when it's possible, and with a good dialogue between all players, having the minimum wages systems in place so that people who work actually have a decent income as a result. Getting credit to all entrepreneurs, including women, including very young entrepreneurs, and that is not a given. Banks, financial institutions, funds, venture capitals will lend, but they will not lend easily to women or very young entrepreneurs who are starting their business for the first time, who have not yet filed any balance sheets and do not have a track record. Asia, in that respect, can do, and I'm sure will do better, using all these schemes. Second principle, the principle of integration. I've just spoken about inclusion. Asia can benefit from further economic integration within the region. While it has made great progress already on trade integration, financial integration lags behind. For example, more than 90% of cross-border portfolio investment flow from ASEAN countries to advanced economies. What does it mean? That the ASEAN countries do not invest in themselves enough because the markets are not deep enough, because the markets are not liquid enough probably, and because there is not enough trust rooted in proper integration. It would bring many benefits. It would boost demand, domestic demand. It would make economies safer by allowing more insurance against adverse development, and it can reduce inequality precisely because credit is more readily available. Now, that financial integration does not come without risks. It's a little bit like the interconnectedness and the interconnections. It has pros, it has cons. Financial integration comes with risks. Capital that flows into a country can bring great benefits, supporting growth, rebalancing, especially if channeled into longer-term productive investment. And there are ways to make long-term investment more attractive, lowering restrictions on foreign investment in services, harnessing private-public partnership for infrastructure, developing financial markets, making them deeper. But capital can sometimes surge too strongly in the short term, leaving the country exposed to sudden shifts in sentiment. That needs to be managed carefully. And I can tell you that the IMF is looking very, very attentively at that particular matter and is certainly taking a less rigid and probably more flexible view as to what macroprudential principles can be applied when it comes to the movement of capital flows. And that takes me to my last point, last principle, which matters enormously to the lawyer that I was and that I still am. Everything that I've said so far is going to rely heavily on better governance. Better governance is probably the politically accepted word to say less, if possible, no corruption. Because without this strong foundation of better governance, it becomes extremely difficult to make growth sustainable and inclusive, and to reduce poverty, and to re-up the benefit of integration. It becomes difficult to escape the middle income trap. Remember, implementing good macroeconomic and structural policies are essential to future prosperity, but in an environment of poor governance and weak public institutions, this is like building a home on sand. And I think in that respect that I don't know whether it's the entire government, but certainly from the discussions that I've had with the Secretary of Finance, good governance is good economics is absolutely right. I believe that Asia is making progress on the governance front, including here in the Philippines, but there is still some way to go. We need a level playing field. We need an open and transparent business climate, free from cozy networks of privileges and protections. We need to make sure that everybody contributes to society and to social developments by paying their fair share of taxation, for instance. We need a clear dividend line between public and private sectors. We need very transparent, clearly implemented procurement rules. We need the support of technology and interconnectedness to make sure that benefits, cash available for the poorest, actually reach those who need it without intermediaries. This is your future. This is our future. It has to make sure that it rewards everybody with intelligence, with focus, with determination to participate in the economic development. It's an area where you don't want to settle for the second best, and where you have to really reach out for the stars. The law is an important support for that. It was Pascal, for those of you who study a little bit of French, who used to say that la loi est le rempart des faibles contre les forts. I'll translate later. Now, what I've talked about today should not be seen as abstract or academic, and I hope you will not go away thinking she's in her clouds, because the IMF very much has its feet on the ground. And whether it is helping a country which is suffering from a major current account problem, or whether we are providing technical assistance, as we do very much in the Philippines now, we are trying to be as practical as we can. We're trying to be as client-focused as we can. And it goes back to the mission of your institution. You are all in charge of building Asia of the future. You're all in charge with making the world a better place. You're all in charge of finding that pause and that balance button. You're all in charge of participating in those multilateral institutions and other institutions of the future that will actually address this world which is global and interconnected, where we rely on each other for good and for worse. So with that, I would like to simply say that we at the IMF have been in partnership with the Philippines for the last 40 years or so, with many programs in place, a good and solid relationship that has completely turned when in 2006 the Philippines stopped being debtor to the IMF, and since this year has become a net creditor of the IMF by contributing a bilateral loan for the overall resources of the institution, if and when it has to contribute to another country that is suffering. Completely change, major shift, and that is a good example of how the global situation is evolving over time and how the economic will is actually turning. With that, I wish each and every one of you to participate happily in this world of ours, which seems so complex, so difficult, where we're not exactly sure where we're going to fit. Don't forget one thing. Look at it with confidence. Confidence, as Martin Luther King would have said, is not the absence of fear, but the certainty that there is something that is bigger than fear, which is worth our time, our energy, and us giving our confidence to other people. Thank you very much.